And there's that kind of coldness, that cold indifference in the face of inhumanity and suffering is something I think has been a very powerful element in the way in which, for example, oil companies and oil company professionals and executives have functioned. But it also, I think there's an element there in our own passivity, as we watch and look on as these processes unfold. That metaphor that's been used a lot within the climate movement, the metaphor of the armed lifeboat, for me is a very apt one. The ship of civilization, has hit an iceberg. And if it's not sinking, it's actually already listing very heavily and people being thrown into the water.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with co-founder of the Climate Psychology Alliance and author of Paradise Lost, Paul Hoggett. Paul's book was published in 2023 and is more relevant today than it was a couple of years ago, given the ongoing tragedies and violence we are all being subjected to and forced to respond to. Paul refers to the work of the poet W.B. Yeats, and in particular one poem, The Second Coming, written in 1919 in the aftermath of the First World War. Given its resonance in the context of our lives today, I'll read it now for those who have not heard it and for the context of this interview. The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. And everywhere, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast is our come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. That's taken from the source of Wikipedia. I definitely recommend Paul's book too if you want to explore the issues that we discuss in this episode. I've found it fascinating myself. Although the holiday season is rushing upon us with gusto, I still have more episodes to publish. The episode on the Ukrainian documentary Divya will be going live shortly. Also, my interview with Lou Leonard, the Dean of Clark University's School of Environment, Climate and Society. That'll be going live over the holiday period. And on Boxing Day, I'll make live the 2025 Climate Roundup with David Spratt, where we'll discuss everything from COP30, AMOC collapse, the National Emergency Briefing, the Atlas 25 conference in Helsinki, and more. All of these make up the main stories in climate of 2025 and go some way to setting a 2026 agenda. Thank you to everyone for listening, for commenting, for feedback, and for getting in touch. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you. Paul, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. And we're talking about some of your published works, which cross between your book, Paradise Lost, and also an article you've written, Confronting the Inhuman, and what these kind of mean in the context of a lot of the things we're seeing around us today. In the article, which is titled Confronting the Inhuman, you say inhumanity takes two main forms. Can you talk us through what these are?
Sure, yeah. I use phrases developed from The Second Coming, the famous piece of prose by W.B. Yeats. And one of those phrases he uses in The Second Coming is blank and pitiless as the sun. And I found it a very apt description of the way in which we look on as the inhuman very often comes into view. I found it particularly helpful, this book that was written by Dan Gretton on the Holocaust and the people's collusion in the whole process of the concentration camps. And ordinary people, ordinary German people, involved as professionals, as technicians, as ordinary railway workers, whatever it might be, hundreds of thousands of them, involved knowingly in this process of mass extermination. And Dan Gretton has a very valuable phrase in his description of them. He describes, loving fathers who in the evening would caress their infants in bed as they said goodnight to them, and then the following morning would get up and authorize the mass killing of thousands of people. And there's that kind of coldness, that cold indifference in the face of inhumanity and suffering is something I think has been a very powerful element in the way in which, for example, oil companies and oil company professionals and executives have functioned. But it also, I think there's an element there in our own passivity, as we watch and look on as these processes unfold. So that's, I think, one probably primary form that inhumanity takes. But the other form that Yeats also talks about, but not in The Second Coming, but in his thinking about his own writing, is a phrase which is laughing ecstatic destruction. And I think that's around as well, isn't it? I mean, if we look at, for example, the oil industry and the oil industry executives and so on, who've known about the destructive consequences of their business for 5 decades now, and have continued on regardless, there is something, almost a kind of perverse, twisted psychology going on for those individuals. And I think that phrase, laughing ecstatic destruction, captures it very well. And I think at its furthest limits, we really do have to wonder whether, for not just individuals, but also aspects of our culture, there may be a kind of death wish at work, a kind of fuck it to the whole idea of the earth continuing, based on, whether we want to get into that or not, but my own thoughts would be it might be something to do with envy, a kind of envious attack upon the vitality and complexity and beauty of this world which exists beyond these humans and their endeavors. But anyway, they're the two kinds of ideas I have about inhumanities, those two different forms.
Can you quickly just dig into that envy idea? That sounds rather interesting.
Well, in the world of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, the idea of envy is a very powerful one. Paradoxically, Shakespeare knew about this, of course, as well. In Othello, he talks of envy as the green-eyed monster that doth mock the flesh upon which it feeds. In other words, envy seeks to triumph over the very thing that it depends upon, because it depends upon it. If you like, it's the deepest form of hatred, of dependency that you can imagine. And that might be typically, in the context of psychotherapy, the individual's hatred, and very often we're talking about men here, hatred of the fact that they do depend on others and they're not this invulnerable, self-contained master of the universe, which is so distressing for some men to discover this reality. Yeah, so there is that kind of element in it of just sheer fury at your own dependency. And in the book, I kind of also link it a bit to the development of transhumanism, and the way in which many of the Silicon Valley boys are now desperately trying to find ways of various forms of immortality, so that they can leave the confines of material reality, of nature, behind completely, including their own nature as human beings.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, there's a whole rabbit hole of this, which we're seeing writ large with these tech bros sort of fantasies in many respects. But let's just quickly come back as well to the idea of the parallels with the Second World War. You had these bureaucrats, and the term, is it Gretchen who used this term, desk killers?
Desk killers, yes.
And I think it's a very powerful term, and it's very relevant today when we see these corporations picking apart contracts that tie in countries to tearing up rainforests and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Can you just explore this term, desk killers, a little bit? And are the parallels really there, do you think, between what we saw between genocide and ecocide?
I think so. I think the parallels are very clear. In some sort of way, there is this ongoing kind of complicity in these forms of destruction. The desk killer became a quite well-known phrase in Germany from about the mid-1950s onwards, certainly for a while, when it began to come to terms with its own recent history, which took, a good 10 years or more before that started to happen. But the idea of the desk killer, and of course it came up a lot with the famous Nuremberg trials, and particularly the book at Hannah Arendt on the Nuremberg trials, where many of the people that were being held before the tribunal were ordinary officials, but in immensely powerful roles. I mean, very good recent exposition of this, of course, is that marvelous film Zone of Interest, which captures the commandant of Auschwitz as really just a career bureaucrat worrying about family issues, and his wife worried about the nature of her garden, when all the while, just across the fence, just across the high wall, these people are being wiped out. I mean, it's a salutary way of capturing that idea of the desk killer that film portrays.
It seems interesting in a funny way. This term, you say, it arose in the 50s, and it came out of this almost like a group nationwide therapy where it's starting to process what's really happened. And yet what we're talking about, the signals that we're getting from society today, we're in the 1930s zone, and we're anticipating where this could go if somehow, something doesn't happen. So we're seeing history over an arc, which is kind of echoing in some respects. With this phrase, the blank and pitiless gaze, you said this kind of stare is present in our society today, and I would agree with that. Does it strike subconscious or conscious emotional responses in others? Do you think we're numb to it when we see others with this stare, or how is it affecting us, do you think?
In the climate psychology field, we think of it very much in terms of that idea of disavowal. And again, disavowal is a technical term which comes from the world of psychotherapy. But what it points to is the way in which, if you like, the desk killer, who can split off his private life from his public world in that way, that process of splitting is a kind of crucial term that we use in our world of psychotherapy. And it's a particular, very powerful defense that all of us use to manage potentially overwhelming feelings. And what we do through disavowal is we split thinking on the one hand from feeling on the other, knowledge on the one hand from belief on the other, feeling on the one hand from action on the other. So the splits constantly leave an experience almost inoculated from meaning, feeling, and action, so that it becomes something purely, oh, that's interesting. almost of intellectual interest, as we see, for example, at the present moment, Gazans still being starved to death in Israel. Oh, well, that's awful, yes, but there's a kind of intellectualization about the way in which we think about it. So that process of splitting is absolutely crucial to our engagement with, or disengagement, if you like, with climate change and other traumas. Is how we render the terribly uncomfortable something that is simply comfortable, we can be comfortable with.
You talk about this particular form of splitting, which allows behavior to take place, which I think is what you're talking about here. And you mentioned that psychotherapy colludes with the split until something bad happens, until sort of democracy, for example, collapses. Can you expand on that, or collusion becomes untenable?
Well, that's a kind of something more recently that I've been thinking about, because I have become quite involved in the whole issue of Gaza and what's going on there. And of course, one of the issues for the psychotherapy world is that the many psychotherapists and psychoanalysts have got a Jewish background. And so it's become quite difficult within that world to raise the issue of Gaza and what is happening there at the present moment in time. And particularly, it's become very difficult to talk about genocide, because there is a huge defenses within that psychoanalytic Jewish culture against the very idea that a genocide is taking place there. So one of the ways in which I think the psychotherapy world has tried to protect itself from people like me and others saying, come on, what's going on? Let's make some public statement about what's going on, is to insist upon what they would call psychoanalytic neutrality. Yeah. Which means we mustn't bring politics into psychotherapy. Yeah. That's often the phrase that's used. And I think our retort in various networks, and many Jewish people are involved in these networks as well, in the one I'm involved in at the moment, Psychoanalytic Voices for Palestine, is that, well, you can't keep politics out of therapy and psychoanalysis. It saturates it through processes of class, gender, race, culture, all sorts of ways. When you're sat in your consulting room with another person, politics is there. You can't keep it out. It's present right from the very start. So that's what I've been starting to wonder about quite a bit more, is this false notion of neutrality. And of course, it's not just related to the world of psychotherapy. We can see it precisely at work in huge conflicts around, for example, the BBC at the present moment in time, and the idea that the BBC is in some sort of way neutral and should remain neutral, when of course it's not. It simply follows the so-called Overton window. And as the Overton window shifts right, so institutions like the BBC follow it. And that's not neutrality, it's politics. So beginning to challenge those kinds of ideas, particularly in a time when US hegemony of the worst sort is beginning to raise its head, I think would put us in a very difficult spot. We have to begin to understand how politicized everything is.
You talk about the attack by Hamas on the Israelis and how that attack, that triggered these, I'm just sort of quoting here, these annihilation fantasies in the Israeli imagination. In a previous episode of this podcast, I interviewed a rabbi in Jerusalem who stated that the Israelis were traumatized and it was very hard to get through that.
Yes.
My take on that was that he was talking about traumatized from the Hamas attack. How would you characterize the trauma and how it relates to the annihilation fantasies that you speak of?
Well, it's an historical trauma, and I think it's not just an historical trauma relating to the Holocaust. I think is an historical trauma relating to essentially centuries of persecution of Jews by mostly Christian nations in Europe. Mostly Christian nations. I mean, I think there have been examples as well of Jewish persecution in these Arabic countries. But actually, the whole history, for example, of Moors and Muslims in Spain actually suggested that throughout their period of rule, relations with the Jewish community in Spain were far, far more fruitful than later on. But going back to your question, I think we're talking about a trauma which is almost inherent to the experience of being Jewish in this world. Obviously, then vastly accentuated by the actual experience of the Holocaust itself. Some colleagues of mine have written a book about this recently. It means, I think, that for many Jewish people, probably for the majority of Jewish people, even those living in the West, they live with a sense of precarity, which is probably fairly unique. And because of that sense of precarity, they're always almost ready or anticipating some kind of attack. And now, when you think of what's happened in terms of the creation of the Jewish state, founders of the Jewish state like Ben-Gurion were very aware that what they were doing was going to create tremendous rage and resentment from the Palestinians, who were the majority in the 1920s. About 4-1 majority of Palestinians to Jewish people living in Palestine at that time. And they were very aware, he was very aware of that they would be very resentful and enraged by what was happening to them. And so the response had to be always, the iron fist, because you were being realistic and not patronizing in a way towards these people that you're oppressing.
If we now step back and let's take the UK, for example, but you can go to pretty much any other European country or other countries around the world. And we are now the sort of onlookers in this. And to some degree, we're complicit because we sell arms and all of these other layers of complexity with it. And we talked about Disavowal, and we've talked about this sort of the stare. How do these all come together how do they affect us at the moment, do you think, in terms of us having this role? Because we see this on social media. My social media feed is very full of people who are very empathetic to the Palestinian cause. There's people that don't want to talk about it. There's people that will talk about it in certain situations. What do you think is the effect on us in terms of everything we've been discussing?
One thing, Nick, that's been very interesting in the UK anyway, I don't know about other countries, but is the way in which climate and environmental activists have also become very engaged around the Gaza issue. And that's been very noticeable how that has become very much a part of their agenda. And I think it is, and I've written about this in that piece that you read, that there is an understanding that the ongoing impact of the climate crisis is going to be genocidal. It is going to be the destruction of multitudes, but multitudes in the global south, safely, far away, different colour skins, a lot of them, different religions, and so on and so forth. But that's where we're heading. I mean, you know this yourself. I mean, I still think, and I still use the 2.7 degree trajectory that we're on. That seems to be the most realistic at the present moment in time. Well, the consequences of that are just devastating. And we can see it unfolding already, can't we, in Africa? I mean, the classic example is Darfur, which the UN and others have written about in terms of the relationship between ecocide and genocide in terms of what's unfolding there. But it's the shape of things to come. And I think many of people in the climate movement realise that.
I've got a sort of two-part question out of that. Does that firstly, does that make us all, in a way, desk killers when we're so complacent about our current situation? And also, there's a rise now, and you give it the name, or it's tagged as sort of an identitarianism. But this movement from disavowal to disdain for the people who are already experiencing a mixture of social, climate, all the rest of it, impacts that are life threatening and basically impossible to survive in. We're expressing a lot of hatred towards migrants and victims of ecocide.
Mm, mm. Well, yeah, I mean, and I think that metaphor that's been used a lot within the climate movement, the metaphor of the armed lifeboat, for me is a very apt one. The ship of civilization, yeah, has hit an iceberg. And if it's not sinking, it's actually already listing very heavily and people being thrown into the water. There are some lifeboats, afloat in the water, and some people have already commandeered them. Yeah. And those who are sinking in the freezing water are desperate to get on board. And of course, the danger is, and this is the classic problem of the commons, the more who scramble aboard, the more likely it is that the lifeboat will sink. And so we keep them off. We have our, stop the boats, both in Britain, America, and Europe policies, and we try to secure our own food and energy resources, food and energy security, as much as we can, so that those who are left on the lifeboats are able to survive. And that, I think, is a very dark kind of scenario, but one, I think, which is coming to life before our eyes at the present moment in time with the rise of authoritarian nationalism. That's what it's doing. That's what it's about. It's the politics of the armed lifeboat, as far as I'm concerned.
You just moved from literally a metaphor to real life. I mean, these boats are in the water. There are people literally drowning, and they're being pushed away.
I think it's 24,000 have disappeared or died in the Mediterranean since 2014. 24,000. Yeah.
And as you say, I mean, I've heard it in conversations myself with people really resentful of the boats and the idea of this invasion or whatever you want to call it, and prepared to take chances with autocracy, authoritarian rule. And it again plays back into this, what we were talking about earlier, was where we're with this 1930s sort of feeling, is where we're prepared to take strong action to save our way of life. And is it all based on a fabrication? Who are the real winners here? What is really going on? Is it just a scam so the billionaires can keep making more money? Is it a total power grab of the world? Is it a creation of some weird ideological fantasy, which is actually a hellscape? How do you see that of where we're going in terms of on this trajectory and into the 2.7 degrees that you were talking about?
Well, it's very complex, Nick. I'm not sure I can give a clear, convincing explanation. But what I've been anxious to do is to look at the nature of the sense of loss and resentment which underlies people's support for populist figures like Trump, Farage, and so on and so forth. And my feeling is that we need to think both in terms of realistic losses and in terms of imagined losses. And both of these things are occurring at the same time. Realistic losses, and many of the supporters of Trump and Farage are working class people struggling to survive, struggling to make a living, struggling from day to day. And they see, I think, rightly or wrongly, They see migrants coming in as being in competition for their jobs and for their houses. Yeah. And I don't think you can just dismiss that as being, irrational nonsense. I think that's a real experience and it has to be addressed. And the way in which it has to be addressed is by linking our politics of climate change and so on and so forth, to fundamentally to the issue of inequality, in a way in which the Green Party, I think, is now doing in Britain, where it's making the issue of inequality of wealth absolutely central to the whole idea of bringing about just transition in our world. Yeah. So I think there are realistic losses, that people are facing. That causes resentment, and a sense of injustice, and powers their support for these far-right groups and parties. But I think there are also a set of non-rational, if you like, losses. Because if you look at MAGA, what is it? What does it stand for? Make America Great Again. Yeah. So implicit in that idea is that there has been something has been lost, some greatness has been lost, some strength has been lost from the past. Yeah. If you look at that same idea in terms of other forms of nationalism, like in the UK and so on, there is a tremendous sense of nostalgia around underlying a lot of the support for Farage, Brexit, the classic manifestation of that, make Britain great again by leaving Johnny Foreigner and we will find our destiny. Yeah? So underlying many of these nationalist movements, there is a kind of longing for some imaginary, more perfect, ideal past, which needs to be rediscovered and rebuilt. And that's the less rational foundation of the support for these groups. So, and I think we have to consider both, And if you look at the latter, the less rational one, that I think is the more dangerous. Because ultimately, if you look at the most destructive forces in society, like the rise of Nazism, that was based primarily upon that idea of an imagined loss. Yeah.
What does that tell us about how the same people who have a longing for this nostalgia for the past and trying to recreate something, a fantasy of some kind, what does it tell you about their perception of the present?
There's a phrase by an American political scientist called Mark Lyler. It's something like the problem for the populist is that they can never live in the present, they always live in the past. Yeah. What we haven't yet seen are the new forms of fundamentalism, but they're there waiting in the wings. Yeah. So if you think of Nazism and if you think of communism, they were fundamentalist movements. And of course, the problem with a fundamentalist movement is that they live both in the past and in the future. They are utopian. They still don't live in the present, but they have that future-oriented element to them as well. Whereas I don't think we see that at the present moment with the authoritarian movements we have around. They're primarily nostalgic, I would argue, the ones that are around at the moment. And for that reason, maybe slightly less dangerous, even though very dangerous, than the more fundamentalist groups in the wings,
Do you think that if there's one part of society that is kind of longing for a past vision, and that becomes the goal or the thing that they get comfort from, whereas many on, I would say, our side who are looking at this 2.7 degrees of the ecological collapse, the climate disaster and all the rest of it, we're stuck in a kind of traumatic present and are struggling to see the future because of that. Does that weaken us? And what's our sort of what's our role compared to that role of someone looking back, and how do we interact?
Yeah, very interesting question, Nick. I think times are tough at the moment. I've kind of been involved off and on in politics most of my life. I do find this year in particular, has since Trump got in again, it's been quite hard to retain that optimism of the will that Gramsci always talked about.
What I was trying to say is the populist spell is to feed you a fantasy of the past that you can aim for to recreate. And a lot of, let's take this, just you call the climate and nature sort of aware people who are looking at the science and thinking, we can't survive at 2.7 degrees, really. I mean, this is going to cause amok collapse, famine, authoritarianism, death, conflict. So how do we cope with a traumatic present when those people are looking back? So they're okay, they've got something to aim for, but we're almost impotent in trying to convince people that, hey, look, we've got to sort out Armageddon over here. And in your book, you said that maybe the apocalypse isn't the best way to think about it. Before that, there are stages, and those stages are authoritarianism, and they take us into some very dark places before we get to the apocalypse. Uh,
Well, I suppose I'm just speaking personally, and I think it probably is manifest in the book as well. Probably what I find is a kind of inner resource that keeps me going is in some sort of way belief in human goodness. Yeah, despite everything that we know we're capable of, history and the present day are just full of examples of human goodness. In the book, one of the examples I use is this marvelous woman, Etty Hillesum, who died in the Westerbork transit camp, Dutch Jewish woman, who kind of kept her love of life going, even as, she was about to be shipped out to Auschwitz. Quite extraordinary capacity to have that kind of undimmed love of everything that makes the world good. And I think for us, particularly in our kind of environmental climate change movement, our awareness of that enormous vitality and complexity of this living system that we're a part of is in itself a resource for going on being, really. Even in the toughest of times. So, in the book, I try to explore some of those issues. What do we mean by love and love of life? One of the little chapters right at the end is called Ordinary Ecstasy. And I don't know whether you're aware, there's a photographer called Martin Parr who's just died over here. And he captured the ordinary and the mundane and saw in it something absolutely beautiful and ecstatic at times. I mean, he's brilliant, I think, illustrator of this, what I would call ordinary ecstasy. So I think we have to find these kinds of, I was going to say inner, but they're not as much outer as inner resources to help us keep on going in difficult times, really.
Reminds me a little bit of Viktor Frankl and his Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the populist side of it, the vision, the nostalgia, and we're talking about, for many in the climate movement, there's a sense of trauma, the sense of, oh my God, we've got to do something. And then we go to the politics, and it's so polarized, but we still have to talk to each other. Because some of the people we're talking about are my friends, our family members.
Absolutely.
And it's much clear, and this is probably, we've noticed much more since Brexit, is that all of this stuff is quite intertwined in our own lives. And And it is existential. It's consequential and existential. And it seems that, yeah, how we navigate that in the short term, and obviously we believe we're right, and the people who believe the other thing think they're right. And I think we're all coming quite often. There is a good place somewhere in it. You think that you want the best for your family or for your friends or for your community. Where does
Yeah.
everything we've discussed? How do we build those bridges? And you've talked about the love side of it. To keep going, how do we achieve our objectives with no time left in a polarized society with so much power ceded away from us?
In CPA, we've started, particularly we got a little online journal called Explorations, and we've been focusing very much later this year on how we engage with the far right. How do we engage in communicating to people around the issue of climate change, people who don't think like us, think in a different kind of way. And I've run a workshop from my local XR group on the same theme. And people like George Marshall and others have done a lot of work on this, which I think is very helpful in terms of beginning to understand, first of all, who are some of the segments of the population who are drifting towards the more right-wing populist, and what do we know about those segments of the population? And then beginning to get some clearer sense of, well, what are their values? What is valuable for them? And once you start to explore that, you begin to see that many of their values, many of the kinds of things that they love and respect and wish to preserve, are not miles away from many of the things that the climate environmental movement also see as being crucial. And so I think it provides us with an understanding of the ways in which we can find some kind of something in common with the other. And the other key thing, obviously, then is to bring into that some of the principles that are very much a part of the psychotherapy world. When you are working with somebody in your consulting room, what are you doing? You're engaging in active listening. You're constantly maintaining your respect for the other person, no matter what they're saying. You have a kind of instinct, I don't know whether it's an instinct or what, of curiosity. What might I learn in this situation that will be new for me? You take all those things then into a conversation, not with someone in the consulting room who's in distress, but someone who's you're involved in having a discussion with around climate change. What can I learn from this conversation? Not what does this thicko over there have to learn? That they're the kind of things we have to challenge. That idea in some sort of way, that way we have of othering very often, people who don't think like us. And I think psychotherapeutic principles are very helpful in enabling us to avoid that kind of othering process we might otherwise get into. And I think it's also important, because in the coming period, it's not just about individuals, I think it's about groups, because in the coming period, groups in the centre and left have to learn to respect each other and work together to keep the far right out. This was one of the big mistakes of the 1920s and 1930s, that they didn't, Socialists fought communists, fought liberals, and so on and so forth. They didn't create a united front against the threat that was looming. We have to learn from history, and to do that, we have to conduct our party politics in a different way, which is more respectful towards differences, minor differences. But, as Freud always says when he was talking about the narcissism of minor differences, for the narcissist, all differences are major. There's no such thing as a minor difference. And it's so easy for people in politics to get into that kind of, I'm right and you're wrong, as you were saying earlier on.
One thing that struck me about what you're just saying, the 1920s and 1930s, is that we did have in the UK the British Union of Fascists. They were a big organization, and they were marching in London. Mosley was there with the black shirts and so on. But when push come to shove, they were pretty much wrapped up overnight. Is there anything to learn from that in terms of how it was eventually, Mosley was put in jail? How were we able to respond then? That we seem reluctant or unable to deal with it seems much more below the surface. So people aren't so much wearing black shirts.
I'd love to know what kind of coverage and headlines were present in newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Express at that time. I bet they were pretty supportive of the black shirts, and I bet that's a history that they don't like to be exposed.
But bringing it right back now, it is very much what you say about the armed lifeboat. It is about the desk killers. We are very much in that right now. I think that's where we've got to be, I think, much more conscious and find ways of talking about that, because it doesn't seem so widely known. I think we're all experiencing a lot of emotion, but we're not able to articulate it. And that's something that I've certainly realized in a lot of situations, in conversations and things. Well, look, thank you very much. It's been
pleasure, Nick.
Really interesting, and hopefully we can speak again at some point.
Yeah.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book, Cop Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In Cop Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order Cop Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.